a relative by marriage, and he's been waiting to come to the U.S., so he's finally been able to make it. He is by the way, we have 100 people who are watching on live stream from California to the UK. So all over the country, including one of our favorite customers, or best customers, who's in Minnesota. She couldn't be here today. She's very upset she couldn't be here.
We should do a shout out for Minnesota.
Yes. David Loyn is an author. He's a former BBC foreign correspondent, and he's currently the visiting senior fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. He's been reporting on Afghanistan since the 90s. He was the only foreign correspondent with the Taliban when they went into Kabul in 1996. He's been there every year since, except for this year so far. And he spent a year, after he retired from the BBC, he spent a year as an advisor in strategic communications for the office of the Afghan President Ghani. He also served in 2021 as an advisor to the Afghan peace process negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government. He's written 2 books already on Afghanistan, one of which is In Afghanistan, 200 Years of British, Russian, and American Occupation. The other is Butcher and Bolt, another 200 years of foreign engagement in Afghanistan. And his latest book, called The Long War, was published this year and covers the 20-year conflict in Afghanistan. It's heavily based on his own personal experience, and with all of the U.S. and some of or all of the NATO commanders in Afghanistan. So it's a military history in a way, but it's much bigger than that. But it's a real inside view of history in the making. We're lucky to have him here because he's been in a lot of dangerous situations. I said he has no fear. He said, no, you have to have fear, but it has to be controlled. Stephanie Foster, who is a friend and a client, and who will be here next week with her book, Take Action, Fighting for Women and Girls, is going to interview David, and I'm sure she's going to include some questions about women and education in Afghanistan. She has decades of experience on Capitol Hill and in the State Department, and has just announced that she's going back to the State Department and with a focus on Afghanistan. She was worked for the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, where she was the Women in Civil Service Society, officer. She'd just come back from the climate change meetings, and she's lived and traveled in over 100 countries, and she is the founding partner of Smash Strategies. So I will turn it over to Stephanie and David.
Thank you.
Great. First, is the mic on? Yes, working, good. Well, thank you all for coming, and of course, I thank you for writing this very timely book. I just want to set the stage a little bit to remind people. I know this is a very knowledgeable crowd, but war and conflict affect real people. This is a book that really focuses a lot on strategic decisions that were made, both in Washington and capitals around the world and in Afghanistan. But just to say, throughout the course of the 20 years in which we were engaged there, there were about 2,500 American service members killed, about 66,000 Afghans in the military, about 1,200 allied forces, including 453 British forces, and 47,000 or more, I think quite a bit more, probably Afghan civilians. So war has a tremendous cost. I think just to keep that in mind as we think about the conversation. But at the same time, also to keep in mind is that the impact of the U.S. Involvement and engagement has had a tremendous impact in terms of some positive markers in terms of moving Afghan society forward. There was a huge drop, about 50% in infant mortality. 37% of Afghan women and girls are enrolled in school. and probably a huge increase, most important in some ways for everyday people, huge increases in their access to electricity and other services. So we know that it's a complicated situation, that people are affected. We also know that even before the events of August the 15th of this year, there's a tremendous need in Afghanistan to really focus on human needs. Right now, the country is obviously ruled by the Taliban, but in quite large crisis in terms of humanitarian assistance and the need for there to be a way to get aid to the Afghan people. So that's kind of the background, I think, in some ways for this book. I just want to say, interestingly, I thought this was an incredible quote, very relevant in your book that you wrote, which is this: Afghanistan is not a failed nation, but a nation that has been failed. And I think that that's really true. So this book traces, these efforts through now 4 U.S. presidents to Afghan presidents, numerous commanders of NATO and U.S. forces. So it's really a comprehensive history, and I look forward to having a conversation with you. I'm going to ask questions for, probably the first half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you. I know this is a knowledgeable crowd. I see several people who are extremely knowledgeable, so I'm looking forward to your questions as well. So with that, I'm going to start. I think actually I would say one last thing, which is Publishers Weekly said, and I think it's true, that this book is distinguished by its granular detail and insider access. It's an authoritative study of where things went wrong. And I was there during the drawdown period, which is how David describes it in the book. So that was maybe a place where there were particular problems. But let me start by asking you kind of the setup question. It's sort of a simple and complex question. Why were we there so long? There were many points along the way where we collectively, the U.S., the larger allied forces, could have left. What's your analysis of why we stayed so long?
Well, thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for the question, and thanks for. I'd like to say thank you to Nina McElmore and your staff for laying on this fantastic event. What a wonderful place to do a book talk and to talk about these kinds of things. I think all of the mistakes were made by Christmas 2001. And if you go back to, obviously, 9/11 happened. The invasion of Afghanistan began on the 7th of October. Pretty swift response. The first bombs fell on, you can't hear me, at the back. I'll talk up. Nina, shut the door. I think it might be quieter. I don't know. The 9/11 happened. The invasion, the intervention by the Americans was the beginning of October. And I think by
Okay, there we go.
there you go.
Push her out of her own store. Okay.
That's better. Now we have the space to ourselves. 20 years ago tomorrow, the 5th of December 2001, was the date that, in my view, really set the tone of the whole conflict. On the morning of the 5th of December 2001, the first thing that happened was a misdirected American bomb nearly killed Hamid Karzai. It killed 2 of his U.S. Special Forces detachment who were there to protect him. He had come in a couple of weeks before and very bravely put together ragtag local militias to try and dislodge the Taliban in the south. By December 2001, this bombing had happened in the north. The Taliban had effectively taken the north. They'd just taken Kabul, and Hamid Karzai was in the south of Afghanistan. Kandahar hadn't yet fallen. The south hadn't fallen. With this U.S. detachment, trying to potentially stand him up as an interim leader of the country, and we nearly killed him on the day that, in fact, an hour after the bomb fell, he gets a satellite phone call from Geneva, from this hastily put together conference in Geneva, the Bonn conference, and appointed as the interim leader of the country. Later on the same day, and this is, why I mentioned in granular detail what happened on that day, the Taliban came to offer a surrender to the United States, and on very simple conditions, that the leaders would be allowed to return to their homes, their farms in the south of Afghanistan without let or hindrance, and there should be no reprisals against senior Taliban leaders. Now, that wasn't going to happen, and Donald Rumsfeld flatly rejected it the following day, and the fighting continued, and the Taliban collapsed in Kandahar. And the next thing that happened a couple of weeks later was you had this tussle for Kandahar between Hamid Karzai and Gulag Sherzai, who was a commander in the south of the country, who had also had a US detachment of special forces with him, was supported by the CIA, and I think the CIA made a significant mistake in backing Gulag Sherzai. The reason being, he'd been the bandit governor of Kandahar in the mid-90s, who'd been the proximate cause of the emergence of the Taliban in the first place. The Taliban didn't emerge out of nowhere as this evil band of people who wanted to put women in burqas. The Taliban emerged from a criminal banditry and civil war that was going on in the mid-90s before they emerged. And Gulag Sherzai was one of the people who were seen by Afghans as being responsible for that banditry and corruption. And America backed him. He took Kandahar. He became the first governor of Kandahar, actually against Karzai's wishes. Karzai was the leader of the country and didn't want Sherzai to come in. He knew who he was. So I think you saw on that day, at the beginning of December, you saw this very strong sense from America that they were only going to do this with bombs from the air and special forces on the ground, that they were going to support local militias, local warlords, effectively, and in many Afghans' view, it looked as if America had taken a side in their civil war, because the civil war had been happening a couple of years before. The Taliban, emerged 5 years before, and so the mistakes that were made with this light footprint of troops and the sense of standing up local militias and intervening, America saying, Karzai should be the leader of the country because he was very much imposed on the Bonn Conference by the United States. So there was a sense of intervening in the country very significantly, standing up these local militias. And even in its own terms, the light footprint military standpoint of the United States didn't work. A couple of weeks later, you had Osama bin Laden, the reason for the war, holed up in Tora Bora in the mountains in eastern Afghanistan. And Jim Mattis, then a major general commanding US Marines on the ground, later, of course, US Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis had 1,000 US Marines on a base in Kandahar, ready to go in and take out Osama bin Laden. He had 2,500 more available on ship to come into Afghanistan, Marines G'd up, ready to go, in order to take out the reason for the war, the man who'd brought down the World Trade Center. And they weren't used because the United States preferred to rely on unreliable local militias who they paid to attack Tora Bora. There were more foreign journalists at the Battle of Tora Bora than there were foreign troops. Because there were American special forces on the ground and some other international special forces. So I go in some detail in what happened in December 2001, because that set the tone for the whole war. So from the beginning, you had this light footprint and an unwillingness to remain in Afghanistan. If America had a doctrine of foreign intervention ready to use in these kinds of situations, with a force of, it was believed at the time by significant leaders who were there, including the British commander on the ground, he said, just give me 25,000 troops and I can hold the country. And it would have taken only that number of troops at the beginning, was the belief of a number of military experts, if they'd been configured in a way that they weren't configured, that we only sent in war fighters with a desire to leave. If we'd sent people willing to do nation building with a desire to stay, America stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years because every year was the last year. You were leaving pretty well every year. There was always a conditions-based withdrawal. Even when Obama put in 150,000 troops, 100,000 American, 50,000 from other countries in 2009, they were always time limited. And in my view, if America had been willing to stay for 10 years at the beginning, you might have been out in 15. Instead, you wanted to leave by Christmas, and it took 20 years before the departure happened. So from the very beginning, there was this sense that the US doesn't do nation building, and there's only a light footprint of troops. And then quickly, of course, you have mission creep on the ground because it's more complicated to do than it looked. You needed more forces, but there was no thinking about the kinds of forces that would come. So they came, out of the perfect order that the military would like them to have come in. And by 2002, you then get this other draw from the Bush White House, as well as wanting to only have a light footprint, not do nation building, which was a very strong sense from Bush and Condoleezza Rice in particular, people around President George W. Bush. In the spring of 2002, Bush made a speech invoking the Marshall Plan, which was the plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II, and said, why can't we have something like the Marshall Plan in Afghanistan? And there was a say, he deliberately went to Virginia University, where George Marshall had taught, to invoke the Marshall experience and the Marshall Plan. And there was this sort of parallel sense in the Bush White House of a sort of moral mission in Afghanistan to leave the country a better place, and the beginnings of women's support programs, etc. And the first $1 billion spent in 2002 of the many billions in aid and military support that followed. So I think there was a confusion about ends and means. There was a lack of an intervention doctrine, because every intervention that America does is going to be the last. You don't do those kinds of wars. Actually, you do. Only 11 of the hundreds of conflicts that America has been involved in since the foundation of the Republic have been symmetrical warfare, country on country, of the sort of, against Germany in World War II. Hundreds of other conflicts, and particularly in the 1990s, when Clinton was the president, virtually every year there was some intervention somewhere in the year, but even in the world. But even then, each one was going to be the last.
Yeah.
And this sense that each one is going to be the last, we don't do nation building, we don't do this kind of thing. You're an empire. You need to be you need to have some sense of a doctrine of foreign intervention, because one day you're going to need to do these things again. And it would be better if, rather than not learning the lessons of what we've done before, you mentioned the sacrifice of the young men and women from your country and mine who died in Afghanistan. I think we owe it to the honor of those people actually to learn the lessons of what happened, so that we do it better next time.
Well, I think one thing that raises, and I'm going to pull one of my questions up a little bit, is the role of the Taliban. I mean, obviously they were in control of the country. They're in control of the country again. And I guess sort of two questions about that, because you sort of allude to this. Should we, the people on the ground, not you and I, but necessarily been talking to the Taliban earlier? Or should we have engaged with them in a way earlier? And then also, maybe at the same time thinking about, we're sort of in Taliban 2.0, and any thoughts you have on how you see them moving forward governing the country. But I'm particularly interested in and I know you write a lot about this, like, we didn't really engage with the Taliban, and should we have?
I look forward to engaging the audience on this, because I know there are people here who talked to the Taliban back in the 1990s, when, in 1996, when they took Kabul, when there was initially, I write about this in my last book, there was a moment in the U.S. administration when recognizing the Taliban as the government of the country looked as if it was going to be something that the U.S. would do, and quite quickly that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. And yes, I think there was this sense, and it was a very strong sense in the Bush White House, that the Taliban were somehow uniquely evil, and that if we removed them, I paraphrase, but not much, then, all flowers would bloom and there'd be a McDonald's on every street corner, and Afghanistan would somehow become, functioning democratic republic. And of course, it's more complicated to build countries than that. So we didn't do the nation building project with anything like the sequencing that it required. We imposed democracy before we impose voting before the other systems you need in a democracy. In Afghanistan, you have effectively the opposite of Jeffersonian democracy. You have representation without, you have taxation without, you have representation without taxation. So people can vote, but they're not taxed because the people they vote for are accountable to foreign donors because that's where the money's coming from. So, so I think, in terms of the democracy in Afghanistan, there were huge numbers of mistakes that were made, but one of the crucial ones all the way through was not seeing the Taliban as just another organization in Afghanistan, but rather seeing them as this sort of evil phenomenon that we're not going to do any business with. And so by the time America, and I write about this in a lot of detail in the book, in 2010-11, in the Bush White House, Doug Lute in particular, began to say, look, actually, we do need to talk to the Taliban. And Barney Rubin was working with him with a small group to reach out to them and see if we could, engage with the Taliban. But of course, by then you didn't have any contacts. And there was this moment in, I think it's 2009, when no, 2010. It was 2010 when a senior, when a guy in Pakistan persuaded British secret intelligence. This was a James Bond mistake, an MI6 mistake. He persuaded British secret intelligence that he was the deputy commander of the Taliban, and he got tens of thousands of dollars. And he said, we're ready to do business. And they even flew him to Kabul, and he had a huge amount of money by then. CIA were persuaded that this was the guy that they were going to do business with. And an Afghan who knew the real deputy commander of the Taliban said, he's not, Mullah Baradar. And it turned out to be just a Baluchi shopkeeper, and he disappeared with the cash. So, 2010-11, even by 2010-11, because we hadn't, the sort of bigger we, the United States hadn't invested in relationships with the Taliban all the way through, in just continuing to engage them. You don't have to, necessarily do peace talks. So I think even in its own terms, that failed.
And what about, how do you view the Taliban going forward?
Well, in many ways, they're worse than they were. They've controlled more of the country than they did back when they were in power before, and they have more of their younger commanders have much more of a global jihadi agenda than they did before. In the 1990s, they were a nationalist, conservative, Pashtun reaction to the chaos and banditry of the early 1990s. Now they're much more of an international force in a sense. They've seen, some of those commanders have been in Guantanamo Bay. They've seen the belly of the beast and they don't like it. They're very opposed to Western values, women's rights, and the sorts of issues that really matter, in every other country in the world. And they're trying to govern. There's been some very interesting surveys on how they manage communications. They're very opposed to international media, for example, and local media, because they try and they govern by fear and violence and a sort of internal terrorism, if you like, that people need to be frightened of them, and they try and control all of the means of communication in the villages where they control. So they try and keep out other media in order to keep people dumb, if you like, in order to keep people along this very narrow, jihadi view of the world. And I would argue very strongly that one of the things we need to do is to support civil society organizations, and USAID with its new emphasis on small funding for small organizations can do this in a way better than it did before. Support civil society organizations in order to provide resilience for the media, women's networks, groups of people who've built up over the last 20 years. Because, as you said in your introduction, Stephanie, in many ways, the war was a success. I mean, yes, we lost the war. Afghanistan's in the hands of our enemy. But we left behind a very different people from the people who were there in 2001, with very different expectations. Men and women across Afghanistan have very different expectations to what they did before. And I'll give you just an anecdotal example of that. I was on this project advising civil society and communications around the peace process last year. It ended, actually, my contract with a USAID contractor ended on August the 15th, which was the date that Kabul fell. So it's perfect timing in terms of leaving. I mean, I wasn't in Afghanistan. It was frustratingly because of COVID and security. I was doing it all remotely. One of the projects I was supporting was going around villages, talking to local people about what they thought about the peace process. Very simple piece of work, and we had a condition imposed on the local contractor who was doing this, that they needed to talk to 50% of women, and in the cities in the north, we were expecting that there would be joint meetings, and in the cities and in the countryside, particularly in the south, we expected that there would be the Taliban, there would be men and women would hold separate meetings. In Nimruz province, which is way down in the desert in the southwest, dirt poor in the middle of nowhere, the women of Nimruz said they were expecting to do this separate meetings. And the women of Nimruz said, no, we want to do a joint meeting. Actually, we want the men to hear what we have to say. And that is new. And they were surprised, and that's a very new Afghanistan. That's so women's rights are not just an urban phenomenon imposed from the top, a Western fantasy. They're embedded deeply across the country. Women and men in Afghanistan have different expectations to what they had in 2001. And in many ways, Afghanistan's an alien country to the Taliban.
I've heard some interesting stories about that. Well, I have one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you experts in the room. Because you did touch on the fact that obviously there's been a big change for the role of women, but you don't talk a lot in the book about sort of as we intervened, and then as the years went on, there was a focus. Laura Bush did the radio address on Afghan women, and there was a lot of conversation around always about the need to protect the rights of Afghan women during the conflicts. And you don't write a lot about that. So I'm curious why. It's a little bit of a personal issue for me.
Be here next week.
Yeah, be here next week. But not about Afghanistan. But I'm just curious why you didn't talk that much about it.
No, it's a very fair criticism,
Yeah.
Stephanie. In fact, when I was writing the book, I knew that I'd have it. There is some. I do write about women. There's a few paragraphs, and I do make the point that that I think in Afghanistan, and right across the board, having watched a number of women's programs and aid programs working, and how they were addressing some rights issues rather than some issues that really mattered to women, which is empowerment, economic empowerment. And I think in the international community doesn't talk enough about jobs for women. It talks about rights for women, and I think it's very. If you look at the Taliban statement, they put out a statement on women's rights a couple of days ago, and it was striking that there's nothing about employment in it. So, I think the expectation of women, as I described before, I think is very different. But the other thing I'd say on the women's issue is that the Taliban weren't uniquely bad for women in Afghanistan. They were part of a continuum. Back in the early 1990s, when the Russian-backed government was still there, 1990 to 1992, it wasn't difficult for President Najibullah to put together a women's brigade to fight against the Mujahideen in Kabul, because they knew what would happen when the Mujahideen came, because they saw the confidence that Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and others were having in the refugee camps in Pakistan, where they began to impose women needed to dress up in burqas. They began, they weren't allowed out without a male partner, all of the other nonsense that the Taliban has been imposing since they came in Kabul. So it wasn't the Taliban that put people in burqas before. If we'd had a coherent foreign policy on women's rights going back to the 1980s, we'd have backed the Russians. Because the Russians, were training women, helicopter pilots, engineers, doctors. They were extraordinary example for Afghan women. So I think that there's if you want coherent foreign policy on women's rights, let's go back 40 years. But yes, I mean,
Yeah.
fair question, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a continual debate. I know many of us have it. How important is to the conversation is that? All right, I'm going to turn it over to the group, and just raise your hand. And when you do ask a question, please just tell everybody who you are, so we know. And yeah, we have someone in the front. Okay.
Hear another British voice.
Yes, thank you. And I'm really looking forward to getting into the book. I spent probably the best part of 20 years of my military career.
Tell us your name, by the way.
Peter Warmadam, sorry.
Okay.
I spent the best part of 20 years of my military career bouncing in and out of Afghanistan, and saw a tremendous amount of change through that time, for good and bad. I'm interested in your view on external actors. I mean, certainly beyond 2003, our sense was the Iranians were a very negative influence on progress, and I'm sure there are many others, but I'm just interested in your sense in the book about how that played.
It's a really good question, Peter, thank you. And striking, you mentioned 2003, of course, when the Iranians became, a more malign actor. The other event that happened in 2003, you'll remember, was the American-led invasion of Iraq, and which, by the way, whatever merits it had in its own terms, and I don't believe there were many, it was a huge distraction for the Afghan war, and it took a lot of the oxygen out of this city. I mean, a number of people I interviewed for the book described how, in the State Department, Iraq and Afghanistan were run by the same team, and by 2002-03, the better people were always on Iraq. That was where careers were seen to be made. Afghanistan was yesterday's war, which of course was a huge mistake, because the engagement really needed to be done, as I described before, in my view, over a sustained period of time. But in terms of Iran, it always surprised me that America invaded both of its neighbors, Afghanistan to the east and Iraq to the west, without so much as a by your leave, because of the 1979 hostage crisis, and relations between America and Iran are the worst, as the bad as any two countries in the world. And I think the lack of understanding here, actually, and I mean, I saw that on the ground as an embedded journalist with US Marines who took most of the Iraqi-Iranian frontier, but didn't seem to have any instructions as to what to do about policing it, or whether they should allow people in or not. And of course, thousands of Iranians and Iraqi exiles came back across the frontier and caused huge amounts of problems from March, April 2003. So, I think, Iran, you can see from Iran's point of view that supporting an organization in Afghanistan that is opposed to the United States, would make sense. And we saw that by 2007, 8, 9, new IEDs, roadside bombs emerged in Afghanistan, so-called shaped charges, which the technology for that was learnt in Iran by the Taliban. It came directly from Iran, and there was a strong sense from them that taking on America in Afghanistan was something that made sense. They also, Iran has a paradoxical view in Afghanistan, because a significant minority of Afghans are Shia, as you know, and they're of the Hazara tribe, which is a very interesting tribe, because Hazaras are very keen on educating women. And so many of the Hazaras many of the women you meet in prominent positions in Afghanistan are Hazara. United Kingdom, which set up an officer training academy for the Afghan army, they had a tribal balance for men, but they couldn't do it for women, because there just weren't enough Pashtun girls signing up to be army officers. So in the end, there were some, most of them were Hazaras. So because Iran is obviously the largest Shia power in the world, they were putting a lot of money into Shia elements in Afghanistan. They built a huge new mosque, money into the into a university in Kabul. And so Iranian influence and intervention in the West and in Kabul and in the Hazara regions has been very significant since 2001. It's been very interesting to see how the regional dynamic is playing since the fall of Kabul. We haven't really talked about.
We haven't.
So what happens next, what the options are as to what happens next. And while America, China, Russia, Pakistan have been meeting in a sort of formal sense since the fall of Kabul to decide what to do. And there's been a broad agreement among Western powers that the Taliban won't be recognized by one unless it's recognized by all. So the recognition is going to be a sort of multinational event. And Afghanistan's previous backers, Pakistan, UAE, Saudi Arabia, appear to be holding on to that for the moment. But although story in the Wall Street Journal this morning by Margarita Stancati, who happens to be my daughter-in-law, so I'd recommend the piece, but saying that that the UAE, Saudi Arabia are joining Pakistan in effectively opening embassies. So while there isn't recognition, they're opening consular sections and there'll be diplomats in Kabul. So I think the regional dynamic going forward is very interesting. And while there is these formal discussions around the world, a much more interesting meeting happened in Delhi last week with the Russian National Security Advisor and the national security advisors of the 5 stans, so-called, the Central Asian republics, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan in particular, the most important, Kazakhstan. And India has its only foreign base in Tajikistan. We know that Ahmed Massoud, who carried out a brief insurrection against the Taliban in the Panjshir Valley before the country completely fell to the Taliban back in August, September, he's in Tajikistan. And the beginnings, you could begin to see potentially the beginnings of perhaps an armed opposition emerging to the Taliban through Iran, Russia, and India. And Iran and Russia are very interesting in particular because although they supported the takeover in the first place, they wanted America out. Russia in particular is already beginning to have a kind of buyer's remorse, if you like. They're beginning to think that actually, the Taliban may not be the answer for their prayers, and that actually having a sort of slightly wounded America that Russia can give a hard time to in Afghanistan is better for them than having a government that they're in control of. And of course, Pakistan is completely in control of, because the other element that we haven't talked about in terms of the Afghan government is the way that the people that the West, America in particular, expected to take power, the people they'd been negotiating with in Doha, Sheribas Stanekzai, Mullah Baradar, and so on, the Kandahari Taliban, were demoted and pushed aside in a power struggle underneath the Haqqani network, who are Pakistani-backed, and the Haqqani network were significantly who carried out most of the big bomb attacks against Americans, killing Americans in Afghanistan, in Kabul in particular in recent years, and are solidly backed by Pakistan. So Pakistan brokered its own government, and 3 of the main Haqqani leaders, who are all now government ministers, are on US sanctions lists and have prices on their head. So, the Taliban doesn't appear to be setting up a government that looks as if they want to engage with the West, but increasingly, maybe they don't want it. Maybe these countries that have been backing them, apart from Pakistan, and China is the really interesting player, what are they going to do now? Maybe these countries that have been backing them up to now, Iran and Russia in particular, are going to join India in a stronger opposition to the Taliban.
But it's a good follow-up for a question, and we sort of not only the geopolitics, but obviously the Taliban needs resources because the country is falling apart. There's, only 5% of Afghans have enough food to eat. The banking system is collapsing. So what do you see as the way forward on a more human scale?
I mean, I think there are three. One of the problems is how do we put money into Afghanistan without rewarding the Taliban and without recognizing the Taliban and engaging with them. I mean, you mentioned the humanitarian crisis, the worst drought for 37 years, half the population believed to be, starving to death by the end of the winter. The sums involved are huge. I mean, the World Food Programme, UNICEF, World Health Organization have jointly put an appeal together of some $3 billion US. These are big amounts of money just in terms of the humanitarian piece. Separately, I mentioned before, I think that completely at the other end of the financial scale, we can and should put money into small amounts of money. $15,000 can keep a women's network alive over the winter, can keep them going. It allows them to operate. $20,000 to a news organization just to keep the support that they're able to do. But getting that money into the country is going to be difficult. And there's a series of technical ways of improving the liquidity crisis, which William Byrd, who's some people here will know, former World Bank economist, spent many years in Afghanistan, now with USIP, wrote a really good piece on the USIP website last week. And I won't go through it in detail, but because we don't have time, but suggesting a number of technical liquidity elements in order to get money back into the economy. That effectively the US Treasury needs to give letters of comfort, needs to allow international banks to have relations with some named Afghan banks that we know are not money laundering. So to enable NGO money, small amounts of money to begin to move back into the country. So there are some things we can do, but recognizing the Taliban or imposing conditions on recognizing the Taliban, which doesn't feel like a very attractive option because the Haqqani network aren't interested in any of the things that we're interested in. And are we going to withhold aid against starving Afghans for recognition? I mean, it doesn't feel like a very attractive policy route.
Yeah, not a lot of good options, really. I'm going to
We lost
call.
a hand.
I'm going to call on here, and then we'll come to you in the front.
Hi,
Yeah.
I want to hear from you.
I'm sorry, Dan Glickman, and thank you very much for being here. So you mentioned the word empire earlier in your statement, the American empire.
I saw a little shiver go through the room.
So this is a more general question in terms of what are the implications for American leadership and American intervention in the world as a result of all of this? I mean, what does it mean for us in dealing with Ukraine and Russia? What does it mean for us in dealing with China and Taiwan? You look at all these things. Is now an America who's just afraid because of the Afghan experience and just going to kind of pull back and not engage anymore? I mean, what's your feeling and what's your recommendation?
Well, Dan, I hope not is the answer. The world is a better place when America is engaged in it, including militarily. There's no doubt about it. Don't underestimate the damage that Joe Biden did in the way that he withdrew. People in NATO were pretty upset. The UK Defence Secretary said so on the record. Unusually, the chief of Defence Staff, General Sir Nick Carter, who's just retired this week, was on the radio in London saying this is not the decision we would have preferred. For the commander for the head of the armed forces of America's closest NATO ally to criticize America in public, felt like quite a big moment. And Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary, tried to marshal a coalition of the willing who might potentially have stayed in Afghanistan for longer in some way, but there was no way of doing it. There was, without US air capacity, both militarily, in military terms, and in airlift, we just don't have the transport planes that you do. Very few NATO countries have anything like the heavy lifting capacity. So it wasn't going to happen, but the fact that it was done without proper consultation, it was a Democrat president. It was Biden's decision, taking the decision he made, only for American purposes, was damaging for the NATO alliance. And in January, February, when the president came through Brussels and said America is back and made a speech at the time, before he made this Afghan announcement, there was a strong sense of relief because of the uncertainty, shall we say, in recent years of American foreign policy, because of the way your commander-in-chief didn't quite have the consistency that the world had up until then come to expect of America. And so I think there has been a damage, and yes, I think Russia in Ukraine and China in Taiwan looks more threatening because of an uncertainty in the world as to what America might do. There is a lack of real confidence in what the US might do. But in terms of the first part of your question, Dan, the US has $1 trillion defense budget with troops in 150 countries in the world. And there's not another country in the history of the world that's had anything like that sort of engagement, overseas engagement. And yet there's a sort of mythical sense that you're a pioneer nation that doesn't do empire building. And I'm with Neil Ferguson. If America acknowledged its extraordinary capacity and was more comfortable with it globally, but on either side of the aisle now, there's no willingness to I think to intervene militarily internationally, which means that no one is going to do the kind of thinking I think they should do in terms of learning the lessons of what happened in Afghanistan and actually in Iraq and actually Syria and Libya, which was a terribly bad war. You can't just do a war from the air. And the Libyan war has caused the way that Obama, with the French in particular, carried out the Libyan war has significantly weakened democratic capacity way across North Africa, all the way to Mali, because of the way that it was done. So, I think there have been some pretty bad interventions in recent years, but some of that comes from America's unwillingness to play the role that it might play. And okay, empire is a hugely loaded word, but find me another one. To play that significant role as a global leader in terms of rules-based international security.
Great. And we had this question here in the front next. Yeah, and then we'll go to the back. Thanks.
I'm Darcy Warmadam, and
Can you speak up just a little bit?
I'll replay the question.
Okay.
I can hear it.
Yeah.
I'm Darcy Warmadam, and what hope do you have for the future for both Afghanistan and America?
Well,
Does everyone hear the question?
Yeah. So, what hope do I have for the future of Afghanistan and America? And I mean, I'm not going to answer the American hope because, in a sense, that's a bigger area. But in terms of their relations in Afghanistan, I hope that America remains engaged. Actually, I hope that, one of the things that Joe Biden has said more often than once, and he's wrong, is Afghanistan has never been a united country. Nobody can unite that country. It's just. He said it on the day that he made the announcement in the Roosevelt Room to withdraw, the room that George W. Bush had been in order to announce the war that had started back on October 7th, 2001. And he went from the White House to Arlington and walked among the graves in Section 60. And there was a light rain falling. And he was carrying an umbrella, but just rolled up under his arm. He didn't put it up, which I thought was courageous in some sense. And he came to the television cameras at the end, and he came out with this very contemptuous comment about the nature of Afghan society, as if it was just a series of tribes in the Hindu Kush, and America had no role there and no place there. And I think that's wrong. I mean, it's certainly a betrayal, actually, of what your nation and mine and many others have done in terms of what has happened in the last 20 years. Afghanistan has had pride in the flag, the national anthem, a cricket team that is now, a global test playing team. It no longer has to qualify for the World Cup along with the minnows of the cricket world. It's It's a World Cup playing team by its own merits. Not a bad football team. And the women's the women's soccer team has just arrived in England en masse, and they're getting training there. And that sense of a completely different nation that was united, that where tribal differences didn't matter in the way that they'd been before, with big cities, is a country which I think America should remain engaged with.
Okay, we have a question in the very back. And then, who else do we have? And then Robin, okay. Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yes, you, Ramin, I know you, and then Robin, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Ramin Javed. Before I say anything, I just want to qualify who I am before I'm asking this question and then, saying certain things.
It's very good to see you.
Former advisor to the runaway president. And also been there for 13 years. I just came 3 months ago, 10 days after Taliban. So I have lived through almost all, and I've been of course I'm American, and I've been involved in Afghanistan for over 25 years. Various things. You're not the only one. The rhetoric about, on the scholarship level, that I hear or we hear is a little bit different than what is on the ground reality. It's a lot different. And I don't know where to start with. Yes, Afghanistan is a country that has never been united.
Well,
This
I think
is
it
true.
has. I think it has.
I'm sorry?
I think it has been united. And
When?
it has been in the last 20 years.
No, it hasn't.
Is there, actually,
Okay.
so this could be a
But, I mean,
longer
I don't want
debate.
to the
Just
larger
think about,
question, but
yeah,
what-
if there's
Yeah,
one,
that's I just wanted to talk about some of the efforts. You're saying that America should be involved. No, it doesn't. America does not need to be involved in everything. Why?
Okay.
There is sovereignty of every country that needs to be addressed. I understand being a global superpower that you have to control everything, but you have to understand that if America didn't get involved in the Soviet war, Afghanistan would not have been in this situation. Yes, let the Soviet come in. What's it to you? I mean,
I'll take that as a comment, not a question. I mean,
No, but I'm
Yeah.
going to ask.
Yeah, go on.
Okay.
Just I wanted to lay the foundation for some of the stuff that I'm saying. And the drug issue, it's huge, and I want your opinion on this. Over 34 countries in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, proudly is the largest producer of opium in the world.
it is.
Why is this? If U.S. and other countries can read your wristwatch from 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away, why can't it see the poppy fields? That's one thing. The leadership of what the U.S. and the Western countries brought into Afghanistan is corrupt and was corrupt, and these are the reasons why you see Taliban now. And I would like to also hear, because when the gentleman talked about foreign intervention, you just talked about Iran. How about Pakistan, who's controlling Taliban, whose all the families of the leaders are in Pakistan? And what about them? What about that responsibility and why is 9/11 happening after 9/11 attack happened in Afghanistan when you have the Saudis being 14 of the 19 bombers?
Can we continue a discussion afterwards? But I'll just pick up that last question. And I think the international community, I mean, Pakistan is a big recipient of international aid. I think actually currently the biggest recipient of UK aid, and a significant, player in global terms. But it's clearly the supporter of the Taliban, and I think Western governments should call them out, because too much of what Pakistan says is deceptive. They say one thing and do another, and I think calling out Pakistan, insisting that that they no longer support the jihadi organisations that they support. I mean, a really really unhappy piece, actually. I mean, just to read this in Foreign Policy the other day by Lynn O'Donnell, who's a really good reporter, got hold of some material suggesting that Pakistan is now supporting other more hardline jihadi groups in Afghanistan as a hedge against the Taliban, should the Taliban fail them, because what they've been trying to do for years is to have this client government in Afghanistan, which they now have. But it's like the dog that chases the car. You know, they've caught it and they don't quite know what to do with it. That Pakistan is now supporting, you know, other jihadi groups, given how much damage and problems that's caused them over the years. You know, a third of the world's terrorist organizations under the US sanctions list are in Afghanistan or in the northwest frontier of Pakistan. This is a really dangerous part of the world, and the Pakistani government needs to be called out on it more often.
Great. I'm going to give the last question to Rob. Oh, okay. Well, we have Rob and Rafel as well. So why don't both of you ask your questions?
Bridget.
We have Bridget and then Robin.
Great.
Right? And then you can answer both of them together.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
And round
Thank
up.
you. Bridget Moix with Peace Direct, and we're lucky enough to have David on our Board of Trustees in the UK. David, you lifted up the importance of civil society and resilience building, so thank you for doing that. And I wanted to link it to this question of not does the U.S. engage or not, but what does that engagement look like? And you said, you know, we need an intervention policy, but obviously the way the U.S. is intervening in the world tends to be extremely driven by this enormous military. And that support for civil society resilience building that could hold governments accountable is short-shrifted. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about what would the right kind of U.S. policy, whether it's, you call it intervention or whether you call it resilience building, what would it look like that would be more effective for Afghanistan or for, you know, broad U.S. foreign policy?
It's a really good
then,
question.
And then Robin, why don't we have Robin ask her question as well?
And
Because we're running out of time.
then I'll round
I
them
think.
up and
Yeah.
sort of close off.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Introduce
Refreshing
yourself,
to hear
yeah.
from someone who's so knowledgeable, particularly about the history of all of this. I'd like to ask a hypothetical question. You mentioned early on in describing how mistakes were made in the first 6 months, which I completely agree with. You mentioned there was a British commander who said, just give me 25,000 troops and I can hold the country. I'd like you to, you know, to flesh that out a bit. How would that have happened? How could that have led to a different path? Because I think that's very important to the kinds of lessons that you correctly say we need.
Yeah, it's sort of, so it's, let me do the military bit first and then come back to Bridget's question on the wider development and defence, you know, relationships. But it was John McCall who was the first commander of ISAF when it was just, you know, 10 people in Kabul in 2001. And he said it actually in a book by Sandy Gall, who's a very long-standing, he's just written another book at age 90, taking Ahmad Shah Massoud's diaries, the commander who was killed 2 days before 9/11. Very interesting book about the history in the 1980s when Sandy was running around in the Hindu Kush as a British television reporter. And I think McCall's argument was that at the time they were very constrained because of the way that Marshal Fahim had been stood up by the American forces, and Marshal Fahim, Afghanistan's only field marshal, appointed commander of the Jamaat Islami forces, the main Mujahideen, Tajik Mujahideen forces, when Massoud was killed 2 days before 9/11, and he came into Kabul against an agreement that he'd made with the Americans that he wouldn't. Bringing his tanks, bringing a large number of troops. And because there was this unwillingness to put enough troops on the ground that might have contained Fahim, right at the beginning, he got away with a huge amount. And in fact, you know, I write about this in the book, and most of the troops who were trained in the first year of building the new Afghan army effectively defected again. I mean, because Fahim had no interest in building the new Afghan army. So he emerges as the first defense minister. But because we had this unwillingness to have any other kind of security policy, and at the time, you see, these people were weak. You know, Fahim and Atta and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and others, you know, and smaller commanders, they expected to face war crimes trials for what had happened in the early 1990s. And instead, they were given millions of dollars and the worst thing that happened in some individual cases was you get a suitcase full of money for giving evidence as to where Al-Qaeda was. So it was very easy to say that the mayor of the next village, he's Al-Qaeda. And of course, the Americans didn't know any better because they trusted this guy because he was their ally on the ground. And so, the Hellfire missile comes down on the head of the guy in the next village. And of course, American makes another enemy. So there were a lot of mistakes made early on because of this lack of understanding of local context. And, the CIA had some really good people who spoke Pashto and Dari, but not enough of them. And they weren't listened to enough. And there was a division between the CIA chief, Bob Grenier, in Islamabad and the people who were in Afghanistan. And one of the pleasures of writing a book 20 years later is all these people are now writing their own memoirs. So, you can really examine and, as well as talking to people on the ground who are willing to talk. So I think, there was a series of mistakes that were made that sort of piled one on top of another. The light footprint meant we had to stand up local militias. The lack of understanding of local context meant we believed people we were paying rather than being more skeptical of whether the mayor of the next village was Al-Qaeda or not. And a strong sense at the beginning that the only American military impetus was what was known, I suppose, slightly. Anyway, they used to call it bear hunting, going to chase Al-Qaeda and the senior Taliban commanders. So rather than any other kind of military engagement, the troops that were there, the special forces who were there, were off bear hunting in the mountains. So I think there were a series of errors that were made, all at the same time, and. It wasn't just McColl, but other military analysts who were there, who've written including Americans, this is not just a British thing, who've written very strongly that a relatively small number of troops, with international troops along the way, if America doesn't do nation building, that's fine. Get Swedish customs officials to run the border posts. Get Australian military engineers who are among the best in the world to repair the broken irrigation system on the Shamali Plain. The irrigation system on the Shamali Plain became a sort of symbol of development failure for me because it was an extraordinary but very simple way of bringing snowmelt off the Hindu Kush mountains into one of the largest areas of fertile land in Afghanistan. And it was broken but firstly by poor maintenance, and then it was blown up by the Taliban in that terrible year in 2001 when they blew up the Bamiyan Buddhas and carried out a lot of bad destruction. And it could have been fixed relatively easily. In 2010, 2011, when I was doing a film about development challenges, let's say, in Afghanistan, there were contractors who were still on 6-month contracts writing feasibility studies as to how to, repair and then they'd go home again, and another guy would come in and do it again, and it still wasn't fixed. And so this rather, elaborate, simple, but amazing, clever idea of bringing this water off the mountains, wasn't happening. So I think, there were a series of problems, and if we could just get some understanding of the sort of force that you might need, you'd get a lot of NATO backing for this. You go to NATO and say, let's have an intervention policy that doesn't necessarily involve force, because NATO would be very keen to do the nation building side. You'd build a different sort of potential. Perhaps it would be led by a NATO headquarters, led by the Brits, whatever, with American heavy lifting capacity, and American paratroopers would be needed because you'd need some security, you'd need war-fighting capacity of all of the troops. But moving on to Bridget's question, you also need development and diplomacy alongside the 3Ds to really get them united. So you have development people with expeditionary capacity, and the UK is beginning to do this. I mean, there are ex-soldiers now running big aid programs in Somalia, Mali, etc. The French are beginning to do this. So there are some, better elements in terms of these kinds of coordination. Now, but back to Bridget's question, still tends to be led by the military. There's a military focus. But, let's work with the military, because at the moment we're not talking to each other at all. It's just like two tribes. I mean, what was happening in ISAF, the military base, just next door to the big US embassy where USAID was also based. It's just like, talk about Afghan tribes. These were, the State Department people had never met anyone in the military, had no relatives in the military. The military had never met a Democrat. And you had these very, very different world views of these individuals. Now, some of that can be smoothed out through training. I mean, if you really want to read about this, there's some fascinating evidence to the Chilcot inquiry, which is the British inquiry into the Iraq War. And a number of senior military and senior development people were very frank about the fact that they just didn't get on in Iraq. And it's just the same in Afghanistan. I mean, the sorts of things I heard as a reporter, frankly, in the field from generals about how useless they thought the development people, and how the development people all along the line thought the military were wasteful. They were always wanting to just spend money and deliver quick effect, and the military thought that the development people had this much longer term element, and they were trying to, once they'd risked lives to take a village, they wanted to deliver something in response, and the development people said no, that's not how you do development. So I think you really need to iron these things out before the arguments happen in the field. And I think that along the way, small amounts of money in order to support local organizations. It was really hard for Afghans in 2001 to get aid money unless they had quite an elaborate infrastructure. They need the famous story, they needed a fax machine, in order to be able to communicate with USAID, and there weren't any fax machines. I mean, it's kind of so, unless you were a big contractor. So, I think there were some fundamental technical errors in terms of engaging with people. We tend, and again, a mistake that was made there, and I think it's very much made in Pakistan, where we relate to the Pakistanis who speak English and wear suits and went to Oxford, and we don't talk to the ones who only speak local languages and have a very different sort of worldview. And I think that happened very much in Afghanistan. There was a privilege for people in nice suits who dress from nice shops. So
Like
buy Nigel Macklemore's clothes.
But as you can see, this is a complex situation with a lot of different points of view. And David will be available for some time after this. So there are lots of conversations I know that want to happen. And we do have some food. So welcome.
Thank you all.
Thank you.